Again, welcome today to today's Transcends Professional Development Core didactic training titled Mastering Scientific Communication, Public Speaking, and Research Presentation. We're fortunate to have Dr. Kristine Steffen and Dr. Paul Carson leading today's presentation. Dr. Kristine Steffen holds both a Doctor of Pharmacy and PhD from North Dakota State University and is the Director of Biomedical Research at the Neuropsychiatric Research Institute in Fargo. Dr. Steffen conducts clinical research focused on bariatric outcomes, including substance use disorders, pharmacokinetic issues, and biological factors, including the gut microbiome. And Dr. Paul Carson is an infectious disease specialist who has practiced in Minnesota and North Dakota for over 30 years. He previously held several roles at Sanford Health, including Chair of the Department of Infectious Disease, Director of Clinical Research, and Chief Quality Officer. In 2013, he joined the faculty of North Dakota State University in the Department of Public Health, where he taught on the management of infectious diseases in the Master of Public Health graduate program and founded and directed the Center for Immunization Research and Education. While at NDSU, he was the recipient of the Mary J. Berg Excellence in Teaching Award, the NDSU Faculty Lectureship Award, and the NDMA Physician Community and Professional Services Award. He recently retired from NDSU, but remains on faculty in the Department of Public Health as an emeritus professor, as well as professor at the UND School of Medicine and Health Sciences, and currently works part-time as a clinical research faculty member at Sanford Health. Please welcome Dr. Kristine Steffen and Dr. Paul Carson.
Great. All right. I will share my screen. And hopefully, oh, I got the wrong one. I knew I would do that. Here, let me redo this. Share screen one and pull up my slides. And Kent, can you just verify I got the full screen there? Awesome.
We can see it.
Great. All right, well, welcome everyone. Pleasure to be back with you, doing another one of these didactics for our Transcend Professional Development Core. Dr. Steffen and I will be speaking today on mastering scientific communication. A little bit of hubris in that title, assuming that we've actually somehow mastered it. I would not actually suggest that. This is a process that we all hopefully get better and better at as we do it more and more and learn tricks and tips along the way. So my more modest subtitle is how to at least maybe avoid death by PowerPoint. So I will kind of get started with this by pulling up a summary here. So I apologize. This is a very busy slide. There's a lot of material on here. I'd like to walk through this with you if I could. So forgive me if it's a little hard to read, but how to make a good presentation. Creating a good presentation involves several key steps and considerations, from planning and organizing your content to designing visually appealing slides and delivering the presentation effectively. Here is a step-by-step guide on how to make a good presentation. Now, if you're all holding your breath and wondering if I'm going to read through that whole thing and you are about to die by PowerPoint, you kind of get the idea that there's a number of issues with that we've all probably sat through and suffered. And so I want to, in my portion of the talk, I'm going to go over general tips and tricks, I think, on how to give any presentation in maybe a better way. And this applies to, didactics and teaching, or to, I think, scientific presentations. And then Dr. Steffen is going to give us some more specifics about types of scientific presentations. I want to go through the good, the bad, and the ugly here. And we're going to kind of start with some of the ugly and the bad and hopefully move to the good. If you take nothing else away from my portion of the presentation today, it would be this point, that any presentation, including scientific presentations, are in effect telling a story. Hopefully you recognize this scene from the movie The Princess Bride, which is a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage you to do that. And in the opening scene, the grandfather's reading to his sick grandchild this book called The Princess Bride, and the kid is like, oh, this sounds like an awful, mushy, corny story, but he gets hooked pretty early in the process. And there's a lot to learn from a good movie, a good novel, and a good scientific presentation. So the first thing we want to do is we want to tell a good story and take home that your scientific presentation is a story of a type. All good stories have a similar arc or bent or themes. Um, so all good stories typically have some kind of background. You have your cast of characters, or in the case of our scientific presentations, we have the background context and information that's necessary to set up the more compelling parts of the story. So in The Princess Bride, we've got our cast of characters and their lives and their issues. As you would with your science material, what data, what information, what science has come before that has paved the way to where you are at now. But very quickly, in any good story, novel, movie, or scientific presentation, you get to the hook or the conflict or the thorny problem. And it's important to get to this clearly, and I'd say relatively early in the presentation. And you want to make the audience feel that hook or conflict or thorny problem. I'm going to get more into that, into some details in a second. And then after you've laid that groundwork for what is the conflict or thorny problem, you want to then move to some path out of that conflict or problem. You're going to show some way of hopefully getting to a better state. Depending on where the science is at in your scientific presentation, that hopefully comes to some satisfactory resolution. But it may not. It may come to where you're just showing the next step in the path out of that hook, conflict, or thorny problem. So your scientific story is similar. You need to have a necessary amount of background information to set the stage. You want your audience to feel that hook. And I would say every time you give a presentation, ask the question, why should your audience care about what you're talking about? Why do they deserve this 15, 30, 45, 60 minutes of your time? And you want to be able to answer that question well and make them believe that that was worth their time and attention. And then you want to show them that path to a better state or greater understanding. So what's the backstory and hook for this talk that I'm giving to you right now? It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. Most of us, or all of us, probably on this conference here, have given presentations or are going to give presentations, whether those are teaching or didactics, or hopefully our scientific work, whether that's to our peers or colleagues, or if it's a local meeting or a regional meeting or a national meeting. We are hopefully going to communicate the work we're doing, the science we're doing, to our peers and colleagues. And so that's my hook, part of my backstory here. You all are engaging this probably to one degree or another. And the hook is, just as much as we don't want to die by PowerPoint, we don't want to be assassins by PowerPoint. We don't want to be killing our audience, right? Most of us, or probably all of us here, have some kind of advanced degrees that, we got A's and B's to get us here. We don't like getting C's, D's, or F's when we get up in front of a podium and give a talk. We don't want to be killing our audience and being thought of, boy, was that a boring presentation, or was that something I had to suffer through? And the other hook for all of this is that I know from lots of survey data that glossophobia, or the fear of public speaking, is one of the greatest fears of all. It ranks higher than fear of snakes, fear of the spiders, fear of heights. Some surveys, it ranks higher than fear of death itself. As you give more and more talks and presentations, this gets less and less, but most of us have some anxiety or a little bit of increased tension whenever we have to stand before an audience or a public venue and give a talk. So I'm guessing most of you have felt this hook, if you will, and we don't want to feel. We want to do better, right? So let's get into the nitty-gritty of sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly here. So I started off with this slide, which is packed with text, and I started off apologizing for how busy the slide is. I would say from the outset, if you have a slide where you've got so much data or information on it that you have to apologize for how small the script is or the text is or how much information is there, just say no. Get rid of that slide. This is the ugly. You need to say it or figure out how to say it in a different way. And we need to realize that our slides are not a script. They are a support to the talk. I'm giving you a talk. I'm talking about the material that we're doing. My slide is just a backdrop to support what I'm trying to communicate. In fact, some people suggest that the best talks have no slides at all, but we're usually conveying graphical data or tabular data, and so we are usually going to be doing this with slides. But if you're apologizing right from the outset or packing so much information on there that you have to apologize, figure out another way to say it. Another big no-no that's in the ugly is bad use of color, contrast, and fonts. And we see people trying to get kind of fancy and thinking, the colors look pretty or they look nice, and just making it very hard to read the slide. This is more of the ugly here, right? Fancy fonts often are distracting, harder to read, poor contrast, too many colors actually make it harder. I would throw in here somewhat the use of institutional logos. We like, to be, we want to be proud of our institution. Some of our institutions may even require institutional logos, and they can be really nice, and we want to kind of show off our institution, but they're often distracting. They often make the slide more difficult to read. And if used, I think we should really be trying to limit these to the beginning or the end of the presentation. So I wouldn't put this in the ugly, but it's kind of bordering on the bad when we get too much of the use of our institutional logos as a backdrop or a background or cluttering up the slide. Kind of moving to the good. So what's the contrast in all this? We want to use good use of color, good use of contrast, good use of the fonts. I usually recommend Calibri or Arial as a clean, easy to read font. There's actually research that shows black on white is the easiest to read from an auditorium, up on the slide. Some people prefer white on black. I tend to think this is the best and sort of minimal use of extra colors. You want to make effective use of space on the slide. So things are spaced out so that the bullet points are easy to read. And then you want to use the least amount of text possible. And I'd say sparing on your institutional logos. If they're on every slide, it's not necessary and it just serves as a distraction. Now I want to focus on this last bullet point, the least amount of text needed. If you can, we should try our best. And this is probably, you'll see I use a lot of images in my slides. And some people may take some objection with that can be sort of hokey or cheesy or whatever. And I'm going to get to why I think this can be useful in the right context. So I think whenever we can, we should try and say it first with an image, secondarily with a graphical data, and then last would be tabular or textual data. So here, you have the image of a person thinking about an apple, and I could put up a text saying, what is an apple? And, the apple, I could have my bullet points. It's crisp. It's either green or red, and it's sweet or tart, and it's juicy and crunchy and so on. And I can list that out, or I can just show an image of an apple, which will conjure up all of those things in your mind very, very quickly. Now, using images can be a very, very helpful thing to do. And I paved this way by pointing out some often quoted data that's out on the internet in lots of different public speaking forums. I will tell you honestly, if you search for the sources of this data, if you will, they're a little hard to come by. So this might be part data driven, part urban legend, but I think it does get to a truism. So here's some of the kind of often quoted statistics. Supposedly 70% of our sensory receptors are in our eyes. About 50% of our brain is involved in visual processing. Our brain can supposedly get a sense of a visual scene in less than a tenth of a second. About 90% of the information that enters our brain is practically, or for all intents and purposes, nonverbal. And it is said that the brain processes visual information almost 60,000 times faster than it can coded or textual data. Again, I think finding the actual sources for these things that are very commonly put out on the internet is a little hard to find, but I do think it gets at a truism that we are much better at taking in very rapidly visual data than textual data. So what are some examples on how we might use this? So I'll use some examples from my own line of work and research and talks that I've given. So here's an example of a graph that is from a study that I use a lot. And so I do a lot on vaccine hesitancy, how to overcome vaccine hesitancy. and so on. And this was a study that was done where they took children who were videoed at their 1-year-old birthday party, as all parents are wont to do. They take a video of their 1-year-old sitting in the high chair, smashing the cake into their face. This is before the MMR vaccine, which is often the most implicated in the misinformation websites as a cause of autism. So 1 year old, you haven't had your MMR yet. And they asked experts who were blinded to the later diagnosis of autism versus non-autism kids looking at these videos to see if they could see in that 1-year-old video features that suggest that autism might have been there at that very early age. And here's the different domains they looked at and how well they could predict these. Well, I can show that data. That would be fine. And I could kind of explain all that as I just did. Or I could take it a step further and I could put in my title here, signs of autism are recognizable by trained experts before MMR vaccination. And I show the image of that kid eating his birthday cake and smashing it into his face and kind of put the punchline in there. Blinded experts retrospectively reviewing 1-year-old birthday videos could correctly identify children later diagnosed with autism versus non-autistic children. I know that, and I've heard from people, when I give this talk, that sort of image sticks in their mind. Oh, that was that 1-year-old birthday video study. Wow, that's kind of interesting. I could take it a step further and just kind of have an image of the kid smashing their face with the birthday video and the blinded expert to whether the kid is autistic or not from later diagnosis, reviewing those videos was very accurately able to predict which children were and were not autistic later in life. That image is much more likely to be taken in quickly, and it creates sort of a sense that is actually more likely to stick. I also just use this slide to point out my preference is that the citation attribution goes on the actual slide rather than a bibliography at the end of the presentation. Because I know when I'm a consumer of somebody else's scientific presentation and it's an area I'm working in, I'll go, wow, that was an interesting study. Who was that again? Oh, that's that Osterling, 1994. I can go look that up, or I can make a quick note to myself. That's the reference I want to go check for my own rate of reference. Now, if you're going to have it as a handout, the bibliography is fine at the end, but my personal preference is citation attribution goes on the actual slide with the study. And I'm happy to hear some pushback on that, why people might think otherwise, but that's the way I like to consume these things. Well, here's another example I want to kind of share with you. So actually, this was a study my group did on a small group of pediatricians where we were interviewing them about their comfort level with talking with vaccine hesitant parents when they're trying to get their kid, the routine immunizations. How do they feel? How do the doctors and providers feel when they're confronting this? And we heard in our survey data, they just hate it. Their stomach is in knots. They got sweaty palms. They actually kind of hope that family doesn't show up in the schedule that day. They're not trained in it. We know that that this was a significant cause of discomfort and others have found this as well, with providers having to confront significant vaccine hesitancy. So I can talk about our study, the pilot study we did. I could actually show the key table, or key graph out of that study, what their confidence level was at the beginning and kind of what happened to it over time as we did a number of interventions to try and improve their confidence. But I'm usually giving this data when I'm talking to providers as part of my hook. I want them to feel and recognize and know, like, it sucks when I feel that discomfort. I don't like that discomfort of when I'm in the office with that parent who doesn't trust me, who's questioning things, even though I've had all this training and expertise and so on. So I can set that up by talking about our study and our survey and so on, and that's fine. But this is actually what I've landed on. This is the slide I show. I chose this glowering, circumspect parent who says one of the most common reasons why they are hesitant. It's just over safety issues. And here's one of the most common cited safety questions. I need to see the long-term results before I'll take any vaccine. I know I can show this slide and all the pediatricians that I talk to are going to feel in their gut like, oh, yeah, I hate that. I dislike that. I've got them hooked with an emotion here that's going to make them pay a lot more attention when I start to show them the path out, right? And I may even use an image to help me with that path out. This is one of the bits of data I like to share with them. In the history of all vaccines licensed in the US, there's never been found a serious side effect after 6 to 8 weeks from vaccination. So maybe throwing the ball back in the court of that parent, like maybe you should be a little circumspect about your doubts there. They're much more likely to have that stick, that little factoid there, by the emotion tagged with that those glowering eyes and maybe a surprising fact to people that they may not have realized. Nothing wrong with the graph, nothing wrong with talking about my study, but what's my purpose here? I'm trying to hook them with the backstory before I get into more data on the path out. So this is to kind of summarize on this image. I don't want to beat this, too far here, but quoting the famous poet and novelist and civil rights activist Maya Angelou, she's famously quoted as saying, "At the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did, but they will remember how you made them feel." And we should, I think about trying to use that a bit more when we're trying to convey our scientific information. More often, we're going to be presenting data in one form or another. We're going to either present, graphical data, tabular data, or textual data. And we should, if we can't do it with images, and we can't all the time, and sometimes that's not going to be appropriate for a very hardcore scientific meeting. But we want to really try and do things in this sort of order of preference: graphs over tables over text. But not all graphs are created equal. And so how can we do a better job at presenting our graphical data? So here's a graph from a presentation that I give to the Public Health 101 at NDSU on healthcare finance. So this is a graph of data taken from a table on healthcare costs in developed countries. And this is accurate, this is okay, but let me point out a number of things that make this an unsatisfactory graph. So first of all, we have an accurate title, but it's not conclusive. And here's a second, I'd say, take-home point for you. Change your slides so that the title delivers what you want them to take home from the graph. Spoon feed your audience what you're going to have them see. You want the audience not to have to work to figure out what's going on. You want it to be easy, obvious, and intuitive. We want the title to deliver home the punchline of the graphical data. So this is accurate, but it's not really conclusive. It's just saying here's what the slide is about. I've got an obscure acronym, and I've done this to myself too many times where I've got an acronym and I can't remember what it is. And in fact, I had an acronym of a talk that I was trying to teach the acronym, and I forgot the acronym, and I didn't have a slide that had, the acronym spelled out, and I was horribly embarrassed at a scientific presentation. So we want to be careful of obscure acronyms and maybe spell those out at least the first time if we can. No data labels, very big pet peeve of mine. I hate it when there's no data labels on there. We should have our axes marked with an appropriate data label. And in this graph here, we've got accurate data, but it's not intuitively obvious, right? So I would put this as not ugly, but it's bad. It could be a lot better. Here's the exact same data, just reshaped in a slightly different way. Here, U.S. healthcare spending is twice the average of other wealthy countries, right? So we've got a title that tells the audience exactly what they should take home. They don't have to work to think what's going on there. Last slide. Wow, it looks kind of like the U.S. is a little more than those other countries. Here we've got it laid out very, very conclusively. The U.S. is twice as much as the average of the other countries. I have my data labels embedded and obvious in the data. People don't have to guess what's going on here. And a simple use of color and contrast enhancement in the ranking can call out the important data. Much more obvious, easy to glean graph with the exact same data I just showed on the last slide. All right, here's another bad example, and I'm embarrassed to say this is from a talk that I gave not very long ago. It's just because I got lazy. So I give a talk to the first-year medical students on social determinants of health. One of the studies I cite is from very, very good prospective cohort study called the Nurses' Health Study. On religious observance and cause-specific mortality. And I plucked a table of data from this JAMA article, JAMA Internal Medicine article, that looked at all cardiovascular disease mortality, either adjusted for age or adjusted with multivariate analysis, and all cancer mortality adjusted by age or multivariate analysis. And you can see religious service attendance was never less than once a week, more than once a week. And here's the p-values. It's a good table, lots of data here. Nice. The kind of smart scientists around will kind of quickly go to the p-values and the hazard ratios, but you got to kind of work to get the punchline here. Well, I thought, I was lazy, but I'll try to make it a little bit easier here. Well, I'll kind of highlight, the kind of the greatest dose response here, hazard ratios. So, 0.62, 0.73, 0.59, 0.79. Well, maybe not people, some people aren't used to thinking real quickly in hazard ratios. I'll make it even simpler for them. 21 to 41% risk reduction in cardiovascular or cancer mortality, either adjusted for age or multivariate analysis. That's better, still not very good. I can make this with just a little bit more effort, simpler, nicer, cleaner table. Here's the cause of mortality, the risk reduction, age-adjusted, multivariate adjusted cardiovascular cancer. Easier to read. I can speak to the p-values if I need to, and so on. I could take it one step further and make it really obvious. I can pluck out, for example, one of the main things to show the dose response here. Regular religious observance predicts a dose-reduced cancer mortality after multivariate adjustment. Here it's kind of very plain, very obvious. It didn't take me that much more work. I shouldn't have been so lazy and just plucking out that, snipped table out of the JAMA article. Now, one thing when I give this talk, I'll often add to this slide, and you may fault me for what I just said earlier about text heavy, but I know the first question I always get when I show this data is, well, how well did they do their multivariate adjustment? How many confounders did they look for? And I'll put this here just to say, they looked at a lot of confounders, and you can kind of look through there if you want real quick to see if the confounder of choice that you're concerned about is in there or not. But that's a much more visually appealing, easy to see graph that kind of gets to the heart of the study. I'll just finish with a couple other words here that kind of come from the TED Talk folks on how to give a good TED presentation. They encourage people to practice and practice a lot. And they say, they have the mantra, practice on your feet and out loud, or at least practice in the way that you're actually going to be giving your presentation. I'd say some not so hard and fast rules of thumb to consider, just sort of some guidelines to try and aim by. Maximum of about a slide per minute, less is better. I've got about a little bit more than that in my 30 minutes that I'm spending with you. I have a habit of going too many, and I really, I need to force myself to scale back. They actually recommend practicing about an hour for every 10 minutes of your talk time. Now, that may seem like a lot, but I would say, especially if you're early in your career and you're not used to a lot of public speaking, it's a good idea. At least practice it to get the timing right. It's a shame if you don't use all the time you're given, and it's a greater shame if you're imposing, like I'm about to do on Dr. Steffen's time here, if you're going over and imposing on the next speaker. And then you want to do as little reading of the slide as possible. You want to speak to the audience. Your slide is a backdrop, not a script. I'll share a couple of words of wisdom from my mentor in my infectious disease fellowship, Dr. Ed Janup, who's at the University of Colorado now. Should be retired. He's had a illustrious, long career, huge number of publications, a really great scientist. When I was presenting some data that we'd gathered at our first national meeting, Infectious Disease Society of America, I was extremely nervous. And he gave me these kind of words of advice that have stood the test of time for me and very helpful. He said, first of all, you know a lot more about the subject than you may think, and probably a lot more than most of the audience here. You've been living in it. You've been diving in it and you've been working in it. So don't sell yourself short. There may be some people out there who are experts that are going to ask you hard questions. That's okay. You don't have to have every answer. And in fact, part of the reason we go to one of the major reasons we go to scientific meetings is to share data and get feedback and get thoughts and get exchanges on, what's the next step, or did you think of this, or did you think of that? These are useful exchanges, and you don't have to have every answer. And then something he told me that I've tried to actually live by with is really aiming to make your presentation clear. And the way he told me to do that was you should make your presentation relatable or understandable and even interesting to a non-scientist friend or family member, somebody who's not in the science or in the field. They may not be able to get all the technical stuff, but they should be able to generally understand what you're talking about and go, that's kind of interesting. If you've done that, you're successful. And so I've aimed to do that in most of my presentations. Just to finish with a few useful resources for snipping images, if you do use those images, there's some websites that have free images out there, Pexels, Pixabay, Vecteezy. You can do a Google image search and click on the tools section, click on usage rights, and click on Creative Commons. Those are all free images that you don't have to pay for and don't necessarily have to give an attribution. My center had a paid subscription to Adobe stock images, which was really useful, really nice, and it was nice when we could share it as a center. A few other couple articles I'd highly encourage you to pick up. You can just Google search how to give a killer presentation in the Harvard Business Review. This was lessons from TED by Chris Anderson. Really excellent article on giving a really good presentation. The journal Nature also had a similar article in 2018, how to give a great scientific talk. You can Google search this. It was in their career guide section in 2018. It's short, lots of really nice bullet point tips from senior scientists who do a lot of presenting. And then last, I'd encourage you to take a look at this guy's YouTube channel, The Analyst Academy. He's just put out a lot of great content on how to do better presenting, particularly with graphical data. Really does a nice job of showing how to make your graphs better. So I will stop there, turn it over to Dr. Steffen, my colleague. Stop sharing here, let her get loaded up, and we'll save questions for later.
All right, can you see my slides and hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to try to follow Dr. Carson here and try not to do any of the don'ts that he suggested. So we'll see how that goes. My role here is to try to follow it with some specific types of presentations that you might be asked to give at scientific conferences and just give a few little tips and tricks, and then we'll finish a little bit early and leave some time for questions and discussion. So types of scientific presentations, there are numerous types. I'm going to focus on poster presentations and oral presentations, specifically abstract presentations, plenaries, and symposiums, and just say a couple words about grand rounds. So these are the more common types that we're probably asked to give in a scientific arena, but certainly there are others as well. So the American Management Association gave a survey and they wanted to know what things should presenters not do. What things do you find particularly annoying when someone's giving a talk in a scientific setting? So they had almost 400 people they surveyed, and the number one most annoying thing that came out in their survey was reading the presentation. Not surprising. Dr. Carson touched on this. Nobody wants to go to a presentation that you can just read instead of listening to. People also don't like it when the presenter doesn't have knowledge of the subject matter. And you can probably all think of a talk you've had to give where you didn't feel as confident as you might in other subjects, and it makes it harder to deviate from those slides. You tend to use your slides more as a crutch when you don't feel as confident. Using a lot of ums and uhs. And if you start to be aware of that when you're presenting, it becomes very distracting because it's really hard not to want to fill those blank spaces with something. And so as we try to change our thoughts or transition between things, it's very easy and natural to say, and so trying to watch that is helpful. People don't like that when it's excessive. Slides going over time, obviously, we heard that from Dr. Carson as well. And then speaking in a boring or monotone voice. So I think this is also particularly challenging in a scientific presentation to try to be your authentic self. Try not to be super boring, super monotone, and then also try to not have kind of a lilt at the end of your voice. So sometimes when we're anxious, we try to bring our voice up at the end of a sentence. It almost sounds like a question. So for example, try not to speak in a monotone voice. We want to try to avoid doing that. Speaking too fast or not loud enough, the practice that Dr. Carson alluded to will help with some of that, gauging the time that we're spending. And 1 minute per slide is typically a good guide. Having bad slides, we heard about some of the ways in which we can have bad slides or not using visuals, and then not making eye contact. So when you're giving a live presentation, trying to remember to look out at the audience and not just be glued to your slides is really helpful. So posters are one of the main venues that we have as scientists to convey our research. And particularly earlier in careers, we tend to do more posters and then probably later on shift to doing more podium presentations. When you're doing a poster presentation, it's really important not to overfill your poster with text. So if you have important information on your poster, which hopefully you do, you want people to see that from 5 to 10 feet away. You want to grab the audience that's walking through a very large poster hall, and people are more likely to stop at your poster if they see something attention grabbing or your poster looks interpretable than if it looks overly dense and just full of way too much text and way too much data. You want a short, interest-grabbing title and a minimum amount of words. Really, a poster is a visual thing. You want to use pictures and graphs, figures, illustrations to convey everything that you can. If there is text, it should be clear. It should be to the point. Using things like bullets and numbering and headlines do help. Putting things in boxes to separate them can be helpful if it's not overdone. Using graphics and color and fonts effectively is really important, and I'll show an example of that. Using a clean and consistent layout. So when you look at guidelines for making posters, many sources will suggest that you use a theme. So pick 3 colors, use a specific theme throughout your poster. And then you always want to acknowledge people in talks and in posters. Most science isn't done in isolation. It's really important to acknowledge your team, your colleagues, the people who helped you with the project, and then also your affiliation with your institution, of course. So here's an example of a good poster. So we've got large, quick, easy to read title, tips for designing effective presentations, large fonts, and then everything is lined up neatly in columns. Important text is large. You can see it from a long ways away. You've got a light background. You've got dark text and kind of a light background overall with some really punchy, nice looking figures on it. So this would be a poster that if you saw it from 10 feet away, you might be willing to go up and say, hey, I want to engage in that poster. It looks like they have some interesting content that I'm going to be able to take away with me. In contrast, here's the opposite. So this poster is too dense. It's got way too much text on it. The text is very tiny. If you saw this from 10 feet away, it might not be a poster that you immediately want to go up and try to engage with because it's going to be exhausting to try to digest what's on this poster. And I think we probably all made posters that look like this. We want to convey all the wonderful information and data we have. The problem is trying to do that really loses the entire message. So don't put too much font on, too small a font. Don't use too much text. Use large figures. Have some color associated with them as well. In terms of poster design, one of the most important things to think about, and this is true in scientific writing in general, grant applications especially, white space is critically important. In terms of a poster, a useful suggestion is to try to make sure that about 40% of the space on the poster is just blank. It's white space. It'll help your other fonts and images stand out and not be too crowded. It won't exhaust the reader like it does when it's completely dense. In terms of colors, people like all different colors. Somewhat this is subjective and subject to opinion. However, most sources will say that a neutral background is best for readability. So a light muted color, whether it's a light blue or a gray or a white, those tend to be the best. And then picking 2 to 3 related colors for a theme. So colors on the color wheel that are close together tend to be related colors. They tend to be the most cohesive to use for a theme on a light background. And then minimizing the use of really bright colors that are kind of jarring. So like reds, orange, yellows, they can have a place and be useful, but the overuse of them can be off-putting in terms of a poster. All right, so shifting away from posters now to abstract presentations. So probably these are the workhorse of most scientific conferences. Researchers submit what we call abstracts. So it's a very brief presentation of our study. And oftentimes we get selected to give a podium presentation and convey this important work that we have in 12 minutes or so, with usually 3 minutes for a Q&A. So we want to very quickly introduce the topic, give our study aim, methods, results, and conclusion. And we should try to not have too many points that we're trying to make in here. It should be clear and concise and get across an aim or maybe 2 aims. But in a 12-minute presentation, it's important to not try to do too much. And then the Q&A is really important at these. So usually scientific conferences, there will be Q&A after abstracts. And if you're the presenter, you want to listen really carefully. And a really nice thing to do for the audience, and also to give yourself a moment to think, is to repeat the question and even try to rephrase it if you can. That also helps if it's a virtual conference, so that people online can hear what's being asked in the audience. And then you want to give your answer clearly, and you want to give it concisely. And sometimes it's fine not to know the answer too. And it's fine to say, that's a great question. I think that would really enhance our work. I'm going to look into that, or let's talk after. I love that point. It's fine not to know the answer. And Dr. Carson alluded to that as well. And then it's good to check for comprehension. Make sure that you answer the question that the audience member was asking. So does that address your question adequately? Yes or no? Most of the time they're going to say yes. A plenary or a symposium presentation. This is the other really common thing that you may be asked to do as a scientist. Usually this is a panel of 2, 3, or 4 members and a chair, and you're all talking on a given topic. So one that I've done would be pharmacology after bariatric surgery. So there will be 2, 3, or 4 of us presenting on that topic. Usually it's a 20-minute presentation, plus there's adequate time for discussion usually after. So these are a couple hours in nature usually on a given theme. So usually your audience are people that come specifically because they're interested in this particular topic. It can either be data-based, so you can do 20 minutes on data that you have, or it can be conceptual, theoretical, possibly with some data or without any. And then afterwards, there's discussion of the panel as a whole. And it's really important to try to engage in that discussion if you can. Oftentimes, a discussant will be assigned, so someone who comes with a preloaded list of questions to ask the panels. And other times, it'll just be audience questions. But the discussion can be as important as the talk in a setting like this. And the last thing I want to say is the use of emojis. So it's good to use pictures. It's good to use figures. It's even good to use a limited number of emojis. However, I think it's really important also to make sure that they're saying something worth saying if you're going to use them in your scientific talks, and that you're not just using them for the sake of adding color on every single slide, because they can be distracting. They can sort of dilute the scientific message that you have and, draw people's eyes away from the message. So if you're using them, I think it's good to use them, but they should be used to enhance the message, not distract from it. And that was the last thing I wanted to say, and I think we'll open it up for discussion. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions for Dr. Carson or myself, or things that you've done in your own presentations that you've found to be really effective or not very effective, or other things that we didn't comment on that people would like to discuss?
I think you did a wonderful presentation, both, and I want to thank both of you for it. I have one small addition that I might make, and I really appreciate this because this is a topic that many people have addressed many different times, but rarely as beautifully. And this was terrific. I love the examples of what not to do because everyone I think I'm sure is looking at that and wincing. Realizing they've done it themselves. The one thing that I would add to this, particularly for younger investigators, you start out and you work the poster scene because you're not a recognized person as yet, and you're hoping one day to get the plenary, 45-minute introduction. So if you've got the poster thing, you're at that meeting for a purpose. And one of them, frankly, is marketing. You're there to let people know who you are, that you're interested, not that you're necessarily looking for a job, but you're looking for contacts. So one of the things that I've often done, and I recommend this to faculty all the time, is that if you have a poster presentation, produce 50 or so copies in color in a folder of an 8 by 11 page size takeaway of your poster and staple your business card to it. Because some people who will really want to engage with you, or maybe they have imperfect English, they might come by with a camera, you've all seen this, and they'll take a picture of your poster and look at it later. Do the work for them. As Dr. Carson mentioned, you want to pre-masticate the information. You don't want to just spoon feed them. You want to chew it. And all they have to do is extract the nutrients. So if they're interested in your poster, give them a mini poster. Staple your business card to it. Tell them you look forward to talking with them.
I think those are great tips.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Schwartz. And I would just mention how a few of the grad students I've worked with, who went to some of the national meetings, just made wonderful contacts and collaborations that came out of that by making it easy, making a good poster, standing at the poster, be there, don't wander off, like be there to engage and talk, and really some good things coming from doing just what you said. Yeah, thank you.
So I'd like to make just an observation and get both of your reactions to it. So Paul's presentation, I think, was intended more for a more lay public, where you're trying to convince them of something in essence. And Kristine's was more for a scientific audience, where you're sort of presenting the data, but letting the audience to some degree come to the same conclusion. So I wonder what both of you think, or anyone else who was listening, that maybe Paul's approach might be a little inappropriate, if you will, in a more scientific place, because quite frankly, if I were seeing some of those data, I would like to see the data rather than Paul's conclusion based on it. What do you both think? What's your reaction to that observation?
So I hinted at that I thought there might be some pushback on sort of the image heavy slide. I'll push back again a little bit on that. So I think probably you'd have to be a little careful with the sort of emotion laden images at a really hardcore scientific meeting. But I think we tend to be pretty dry and sleepy. I've sat through so many scientific meetings where I am struggling to stay engaged. And I think if you can find a few hooks to help your audience feel it and stay engaged, is useful even in that setting. Now, I can speak. My point with that is let the data be very apparent, and I can speak to the statistical significance, the N, and so on. I can speak to it, or I can put a couple of small pieces on that slide to flesh that out. But and I would say that the way I was presenting is more appropriate. I wouldn't say for a lay audience, but for a didactic, so a teaching kind of session is maybe more appropriate. But I would at least put back to you to consider, are some of those tools even helpful in a more scientific setting? And I would say, what are the more memorable talks you've gone to? It's often those people that are gifted speakers, know how to incorporate humor, know how to incorporate other elements that kind of wake you up and get your attention. But we got a lot of probably hardcore scientists here that are going to go, oh my gosh, that's not appropriate. But I'd be interested in what other people have to say. I see Don Jervich has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. And good point by Dr. Wynn. I think what is being brought up are the different types of learners and audiences, right? So I grew up learning that there are four different types of listeners. Some are experiential, some are data, just the data. I only want the data. Some are in between, and some are more ethereal. So you have to rotate through the four quadrants, has been one recommendation so that you can capture the attention of the audience. So I think all really good points. And again, I don't know, how you slides develop into, addressing each of those four things, but I think the storytelling is part of the experiential learning, for people that learn that way. And then, like I say, the data is the graphs and, the presentations that in that manner. So that's what I would add to the conversation.
And I agree. So I think probably being a more pure scientist and being a little bit boring and rigid. I can think of talks early in my career that were stunningly boring. I did not want to be accused of not having a full read of the literature or giving the facts, and they were just, data after data. And I think it really did lose the message. And so I think there's the possibility to do both things. I think we can give the take-home message, like Paul said, but then I think we can use a couple of slides or a couple of examples to back it up and say, here's the evidence that supports why we think this or why we're showing this. And I think that's the best way to do it. And that's the way I've shifted to grant writing now. I tell the reviewer, bariatric surgery leads to malabsorption. Well, then I provide the evidence for that, but I tell them the take home point. And so I think it's possible to do both things simultaneously, effectively.
Dave's got his hand raised, and I think Steve may be unmuted too. So maybe Dave, and then Steve, if you had a comment too. Go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to follow up. I think this is a great discussion, and I do wonder if we will evolve in a way how we can back our statement with evidence and how we express that visually or otherwise, because I can imagine the audience wanting to be discerning between media and truth or evidence, and being able to have that p-value or the confidence interval in your back pocket as a speaker can be challenging unless there's a place to put that in your notes you can refer to and maybe do it verbally rather than visually, or distinguish the scientific values that do distinguish themselves as significant with a certain type of font or distinguishing characteristic. But I wonder, as we evolve this thought, if we could express ourselves clearly but more simply with regard to scientific evidence. It's a good discussion.
Paul, I was going to talk a little bit about the audience, which has been covered by Josh and others. But I think you guys did a great job of helping us wrap our heads around technical skills for presenting. But another thing that I think is really important is really taking a minute and trying to understand who's the audience you're trying to talk to. And in my opinion, if nobody's listening, it's not a talk, it's something else. And so really thinking through, for example, if I'm talking to a bunch of busy, hardworking internists, I might give a different kind of talk than if I'm talking to a bunch of biostatisticians. And it's not just the slides, it's the way I spin it, where I put the emphasis, and what's the message I want to deliver. So I'm just thinking a lot these days about who is my audience.
For sure. Those are all great points. And anybody who's gone to most of my talks, it's got lots of p-values and confidence intervals and graphic data. I mean, that's what I do. But I would maybe emphasize the one point that I think sometimes we don't do well enough, and that is trying to make our audience, any audience, I would say here, is feel that hook. Like why should they care? Why do they deserve 30, 40, 50 minutes of my time? Why do I deserve, 30, 40, 50 minutes of their time, I should say. So, doing something that really kind of drives that hook home to engage them, I think is important in any audience. But these are all very, very fair points. And I would not say you need 30, emotion-laden images, for every talk. It's the right dose at the right time, and knowing the audience. Those are all very good points. Thank you. Any other last questions or comments? This is great feedback. Really good discussion. All right. Please fill out the evaluation form. As Kent asked, anything else you want to say, Kent?
Well, just thank you to Dr. Steffen and Dr. Carson for the great discussion and presentation today. And we
Great.
hope
Thank
to
you,
see you on
everyone.
January 13th again as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
Stay
Have a
warm.
great day.